Nicholas Rinsky is standing on the wall. When the first smoke appears to the south, he has known it was coming for weeks. Word travels fast on this frontier, faster than armies usually. But knowing and seeing are different things, and what he is looking at now takes a moment to resolve, because it does not look like an army. It looks like the horizon has been replaced. Movement where there was stillness, a darkness spreading at the edge of the summer sky that the mind keeps trying to read as something else before it accepts what it actually is. He is in his late 40s. His body carries the full accounting of a life spent fighting on the Croatian-Hungarian frontier. He has faced the Ottomans for 3 decades. He was present at the Siege of Vienna in 1529, young enough then to still be surprised by things. He is not surprised. Now the road behind him is still open. This is the fact that must be understood before anything else in this story makes sense. Zedrinsky is not trapped here. He has horses, he has rank, he has the experience to execute an orderly withdrawal and the standing to justify one to anyone who might later question it. The strategic case for leaving is sound. What is coming toward him across the plain is not something a fortress of this size was built to stop indefinitely, not against these numbers. He knows this better than almost anyone alive at the time. He stays anyway. The scale of what is coming arrives not as a number but as a physical fact, first as sound, a low percussion moving through the earth itself, the accumulated weight of 100,000 men and 300 cannons pressing into the ground of southern Hungary. Then as smell, smoke and horses, and the displaced air of something so large it generates its own pressure. Then as shape, thousands resolving into tens of thousands, into something that stops being countable and becomes instead a feature of the landscape, a new geography, one man standing between that and a fortress at his back. What follows is 33 days that will cost more human lives than the mathematics of a Bordeaux skirmish have any right to produce. What follows is the death of the greatest sultan in Ottoman history in a tent with an earshot of a fortress he never saw fall. What follows is a powder magazine explosion planned before the last man walked out the gate that killed 3,000 soldiers after the fighting stopped. What follows is the question this story has been asking ever since. What does a man purchase with his life if he spends it right, and what does it cost everyone around him to find out before we go any further? If this kind of history means something to you, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe and leave a comment below. It genuinely helps this story reach more people. Now back to 1566. The story of Szigetvár does not begin in 1566. It begins roughly a century and a half earlier with the slow, grinding pressure of Ottoman expansion, pressing north and west through a Christian Europe that could not agree on how to stop it. Constantinople fell in 1453. Belgrade fell in 1521. Rhodes fell in 1522. Hungary was cracked open at Mohacs in 1526, where the Hungarian army was destroyed in under 2 hours, and King Louis II drowned in a marsh while fleeing the battlefield. Each name on that list was not merely a military Loss, it was another step in a march. That to the people living through it looked like it would not stop until there was nothing left to stop it. The Ottoman Empire in the mid-6th century was the most powerful state on earth. It controlled the Balkans, most of the Middle East, vast stretches of North Africa from Egypt to Algeria and the strategic sea lanes of the Eastern Mediterranean. Its Janissaries selected young, trained, over years paid consistently with the finest professional soldiers in the world. Its artillery was unmatched in range and destructive capacity. Fly system could keep armies fed and armed in the field for months at distances that would have ground any European force into the dirt. And it was led, for most of this period, by a man of genuine strategic genius who had no intention of stopping. Christian Europe, facing all of this, could not get out of its own way. The Habsburgs were divided between their Austrian and Spanish branches, both overstretched, both fighting conflicts on too many fronts to commit fully to the eastern frontier. The Pope sent diplomatic pressure and blessings where he could not send soldiers. The French, who shared a continent with the Habsburgs and had every reason to stand with them against an empire pressing in from the east, spent much of this period in active diplomatic cooperation with Constantinople, because their rivalry with the Habsburgs mattered more to them than the threat closing in from the east. Christian Europe was not a unified defensive alliance. It was a collection of competing interests that happened sometimes to share a religion. The Hungarian kingdom, which had for generations served as the strategic shield of Central Europe, was by 1566 no longer a functioning kingdom. It had been divided into three pieces: the Ottoman-controlled south and center, narrow Habsburg-administered strip in the northwest, and the vassal state of Transylvania, nominally independent, practically an Ottoman client. The shield had not cracked, it had been dismantled and distributed. That is the Worldvar sits inside. Vienna is the prize. It has always been the prize. Ottoman campaign of 1529 reached its walls and was turned back, not defeated in the field, but stopped by logistics, stretched to their limit by a campaigning season running out, by walls that proved more resilient than expected. Sullivan has not forgotten. 1529. A man with his ambition and his pride does not forget the thing he did not finish. The road to Vienna runs through southern Hungary. The road through southern Hungary runs through a marshy fortress town that most of the world has never heard of. Szigetvár is not the destination, it is the door that has to be kicked open before the destination becomes reachable. The door, as Suleiman is about to discover, was built by someone who spent years making sure it would not open easily. Suleiman, that has been called the Magnificent by his European enemies and the lawgiver by his own people. Both names are accurate. Neither is sufficient. At his height, and the heights was real, not the flattery of court historians, he was the most powerful ruler alive. He had taken Belgrade, Rhodes, most of Hungary and Mesopotamia. He had destroyed the Hungarian army at Mohacs in under 2 hours. He had driven the Knights of St. John from Rhodes and established Ottoman naval dominance across the eastern Mediterranean, he was a poet, his verse survives and it holds up. It is not a powerful man playing at art, he was a builder. The Suleymaniye Mosque in Constantinople, completed in 1558, remains one of the finest buildings ever constructed, and he was a lawgiver in the most substantive sense. His legal reforms, the Conan-shaped Ottoman administration for a century after his death. His court was the most sophisticated in the world during his reign. Diplomats from every European power came to Constantinople and left with a clear understanding that they had negotiated with someone of extraordinary caliber. The difference they showed was not performance. They had sat across a table from this man. They knew what he was. By the summer of 1566, he is 71 years old. Gout had destroyed his joints to the point where he could not ride a horse unaided. He was carried through the Balkans in a litter for this final campaign, which was not merely an indignity but a political problem. Sultan's authority rested partly on the visible fact of his presence as a commander, on the image of the ruler among his troops, active and in control. The litter required careful management. The doctors riding alongside him carried the barely concealed fear of men who know their patient is running out of road and cannot say so in the presence of soldiers who must not know it. His generals made decisions that would previously have required the Sultan's explicit personal approval. His grand vizier Sakalu Mehmed Pasha had been quietly absorbing responsibilities that protocol reserved for the Sultan alone. But the will had not gone with the body. Vienna had waited since 1529. That unfinished campaign was not a military abstraction for Sulian, it was personal. The city that had turned him back, the walls that had not broken had been open in him like something unhealed. For 37 years, this campaign was the answer. He had assembled 100,000 soldiers and 300 cannons, the largest and most powerful army of his reign. He had committed to leading it himself in person, in a litter, if necessary, because the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire did not send armies to do his work. He led them. Even dying, he led them. This is the man who arrived in the marshes of southern Hungary in the summer of 1566. Not the conqueror of roads, not the lawgiver of a great empire. A 71-year-old man in a litter carried by other men toward a fortress town with his name on the road. It was blocking a man running on, will alone. Long after this body had already given notice, he died. Within earshot of a fortress he never saw fall. Nikola IV. Zerinsky is the center of this story. The empire, the Sultan, the fortress, the politics, all of it exists to frame the choice he made and what that choice cost. He is not young, in 1566, late 40s, and which, for a man who has spent his adult life fighting on the Croatian-Hungarian frontier, is genuinely old. The frontier ages men faster than other places do. He had been fighting the Ottomans since before most of his garrison was born. He was at the siege of Vienna in 1529 as a young man, watching the Ottoman tide come to the walls of the Habsburg capital and then pull back, and understanding from that moment what it meant when an empire brought its full force to bear, and what it meant when That force finally met something it could not break quickly enough. He spent the decades after Vienna watching the slow erosion of Christian territory, engagement by engagement, year by year. He had buried more friends than he could count. He was Ban of Croatia, the highest military and administrative office in the Croatian kingdom. He was a nobleman of immense wealth with estates across the region and political connections that extended well beyond the frontier. He was royal master of the treasury. He had options, real options, not the consolation of a trapped man reaching for exits that do not exist. When word came that Sullian's army was marching north and that Szigetvár laid directly in its path, Srinsky did not face a simple binary between cowardice and heroism. He faced a genuine strategic question, with a defensible answer on the side of withdrawal. His garrison could not permanently stop 100,000 men and 300 cannons, not to a conclusion that left him standing, pulling back, preserving his force, fighting in better conditions elsewhere. This was not shameful. It was the kind of decision experienced commanders made in exactly these circumstances. He chose to stay. The answer is not one thing. There was honor, the Croatian and Hungarian military tradition that placed enormous weight on dying well, on not retreating from a position you had committed to hold. There was the strategic calculation that every day Szigetvár held was a day the Ottoman army could not advance toward Vienna, where Emperor Maximilian II was assembling a relief force. There was the knowledge built over years of preparation that Szigetvár, properly defended, could lead the Ottomans far beyond what a fortress its size had any business costing them. And there was something harder to name, a sense that this was the moment, that the stand he was about to make was the one his entire life had been building toward. He had not inherited this fortress, he had chosen it, improved it, built around it the artificially flooded terrain, the stockpiled food and ammunition and powder, the reinforced walls, the layered three-zone defensive structure. These were not features he found when he arrived. They were decisions he had made over years, knowing this day would come. These were not the preparations of a man expecting rescue. They were the preparations of a man who intended to fight alone for as long as possible and to make that fight as expensive as possible for whoever came to end it. Before the siege closed around him, he wrote letters to Maximilian II, to the Pope, to the Croatian nobility. Those letters, read across 4.5 centuries, do not read like requests for reinforcement. They read like a man settling his affairs before a journey he will not return from, not in despair, not in performance, but with the calm, clear-eyed quality of a man who has made his decision and is at peace with it. He was saying goodbye. He was doing it in writing carefully, because that was the kind of man he was. He gathered 200-300 men, Croats, Hungarians, a handful of others, and made them swear, hold, do not surrender, make the Ottomans pay for every inch of ground. He threatened execution for any man found communicating with the enemy. This was not a speech for morale, it was a covenant. These men were not being asked to try their best, they were being asked to die well, and they said yes. But the question underneath all of it, the one this story never fully resolves and is this: what is the difference between a man who chooses to die for something and a man who simply could not find a reason to live, and does the distinction matter when the consequences are the same? Before the guns open up, you need to be able to see Szigetvár not as an abstraction on a map, but as a physical place with a specific logic that explains how 2,300 men held 100,000 at bay for 33 days. The name tells you the essential thing. Szigetvár means island castle. The fortress sat in the marshy lands of southern Hungary, surrounded by artificial lakes and wetlands that had been engineered over decades, not inherited from the landscape. The marsh was not a geographic accident that Zedrinsky was fortunate to have. It was a weapon. Men had built it, flooded it, shaped it deliberately so that anyone coming to take this place would have to fight through water and mud before they even reached the walls. The fortress was 3 nested zones. The outermost ring was the new town, the first line, the most exposed, the position built to extract cost before being surrendered. Behind it sat the old town with a tighter perimeter, reinforced walls, and better defensive angles. At the center was the citadel, the inner city, the final position, the place where the last men would make the last stand. Each zone was designed not to hold forever, but to make the taking of it hurt badly enough that by the time an attacker reached the next wall, he had already paid more than he expected. To take Szigetvár, an army had to fight 3 separate battles, each time crossing water and rubble, and the wreckage of whatever it had just destroyed, to face men who had pulled back to a prepared position and were waiting. There was one vulnerability in the summer of 1566. Drought had lowered the lake levels. The water that was supposed to make direct assault nearly impossible was shallower than designed. Zinsk's engineers knew it. The Ottomans would find it soon enough, and they would use it. One detail from the opening of the siege is too alive to leave out. When the Ottoman vanguard appeared on the horizon, the defenders of Szigetvár decorated the walls with bright red cloth and fired a single cannon in greeting, not in panic, not in resignation, in greeting whatever was about to happen inside those walls. It was not happening to men who had already given up. The Ottoman army surrounding Szigetvár was not a faceless mass. It was led by specific men with specific abilities, specific ambitions, and specific moral characters. And the way those men operated shaped the siege as much as any decision made inside the walls. Solu Mehmed Pasha is the most important figure on the Ottoman side after Sullian himself. He is the Grand Vizier, the man who actually runs the campaign. As the Sultan grows progressively less able to function in the field, he was born in Herzegovina, which means he understands the Balkans in a way that someone raised in Constantinople never quite does. He is politically brilliant, steady in a crisis, and the kind of man who makes good decisions when everything around him is coming apart. He's also the man who will very shortly be standing over the body of the most powerful ruler in the world and deciding what to do about it. with 100,000 soldiers in the field who cannot know, keep that in mind when assessing what kind of man he is. His nephew Mustafa Bar of Bosnia serves as both soldier and diplomat. He is capable enough that both Ottoman and Habsburg sources recorded him with genuine respect, which in this period of history, when enemies rarely found anything generous to say about each other, is a distinction that actually means something. Then there is Shuvab, the Bey of Skol. He is something else entirely, infamous among the Hungarians as a brutal overlord, notorious among the Austrians as a man who treated plunder as a right and treaties as inconveniences, known among his Ottoman peers as someone who operated with active contempt for the Sultan's laws when those laws conflicted with his interests by any straightforward moral accounting. He is not an admirable man, and yet his soldiers follow him with an unswerving loyalty that none of the more principled commanders in this army can produce. He drives the direct assaults on Szigetvár with a relentlessness that will cost the Ottoman army thousands of lives. He does not work with tactical finesse, he works with grinding, sustained human pressure, assault after assault, regardless of cost, until something gives. He is not a villain in this story in any simple sense. He is a specific type of commander, the kind who produces results by spending men without hesitation, and who does not stop until the objective is taken or there is no one left to send. These three men, different in almost every way that matters, are what Zinski is actually fighting, not an empire. The abstract, three specific men and the army that answers to them. One quick note before the fighting starts: if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. We cover stories like this every week. Battles and decisions that shaped the world but didn't make most textbooks. Subscribe and hit the bell. Now August 1566. And the guns. The Ottoman artillery opened on Szigetvár in early August 1566. And what followed was unlike anything the garrison had experienced. 300 cannons day and night. 300 cannons is a number that needs to be felt, not filed away. The bombardment was constant, without pause, without rhythm that allowed adjustment or rest. The sound alone was a weapon. It came not just through the air, but through the ground, through the walls, through the bones of every man standing his watch. It made sustained sleep impossible. It degraded judgment over days. It wore down the nervous system the way water wears down stone, not with one blow, but by simply never stopping. The outer walls of the new town began coming apart in days rather than weeks. This was the most advanced military technology in the world in 1566, deployed at full weight against fortifications built for an earlier era of warfare. Zerinski's response was active from the first day. He organized his defenders into rotating shifts to ensure the walls were always manned, regardless of casualties or exhaustion. He directed counter-fire, fewer guns than the Ottomans, but aimed with enough precision to cause real disruption, and he organized sorties, fast, aggressive raids outside the walls, targeting Ottoman engineers, disrupting the construction of forward-firing positions, and killing officers the sorties cost. Lives the garrison could not replace easily, but they served a purpose that went beyond the tactical, yet they showed it the only way that meant anything out there by going outside the walls and making the Ottomans bleed for their siege works. They were not counting down, they were fighting, and they intended to keep fighting. First major assault came on August 6th. It was repulsed, the second on August 9th, driven by Cheshire Bay. Characteristically impatient aggression took the new town. The first zone had fallen. Now look at what it cost more than 3,000 Ottoman casualties against approximately 300 defenders lost. Zhinski pulled his men back to the old town in good order. Not a rout, not men running. Deliberate pullback to the next line. Exactly as it had been planned. That exchange rate deserves to be stated plainly. For every defender who died, the new town, more than 10 Ottoman soldiers died trying to take it from him. If those numbers held through the rest of the siege, the Ottoman army had a problem that more men alone could not solve. Those numbers more or less held. The old town was harder, the defensive perimeter was tighter and better reinforced, but more than that, Zhinski now had the ruins of the new town working for him. The rubble, the destroyed buildings, the wreckage the Ottomans had created taking the first zone, all of it now working for the defenders. Rubble that broke up Ottoman formations, ruined streets that pushed attacking columns into narrow gaps where Zhinski's men could pour fire into them from three sides. He had turned the destruction against the men who caused it. This was not improvisation, it was the natural result of a defensive structure designed with exactly this kind of layered cost in mind. Sheshuab's response to difficulty was the same as it always was. More assaults, 10 assaults in 10 days. The human cost fell almost entirely on the Ottoman side, the Janissaries on selected young, trained over years, the finest infantry the empire could field. Of Vicar died in the approaches to the old town walls in numbers that no military accounting could justify. They were not replaceable on any short timeline. The experience of their officers, the hard-won understanding of how to press an assault when everything is going wrong, the kind of steadiness that only comes from having survived previous campaigns, all of it draining away day by day into the marsh outside Szigetvár. Somewhere in this phase, Sulian made Zhinski an offer: surrender the fortress and be made lord of all Croatia under Ottoman vassalage. This was a real offer, not a bluff, not a negotiating tactic, but something the Sultan actually had the power to deliver for a man in Zhinski's position, surrounded, outnumbered 40-1, with no confirmed relief coming. This was not a trivial thing. Zerinski's response was silence. Not a defiant speech, not a counter offer. He simply did not answer. That silence across more than 4 centuries remains one of the most eloquent things in this entire story. Sakalu Mehmed Pasha tried a different approach. Letters in Croatian and Hungarian fired into the walls on arrows, promising to spare the defenders if they opened the gates. These went unanswered as well. For a specific reason the Ottomans did not know. On the first day of the siege, Zhinski had made his men swear an oath and had made clear that any soldier found communicating with the enemy would face execution. The letters landed inside walls manned by men who had already decided there was nothing left to negotiate. The old town fell on August 19th. Between the two phases, Ottoman losses had become genuinely catastrophic. What remained was the citadel, roughly 600 men, and a garrison that had been reduced from 2,300 to a fraction of its original strength, while inflicting losses at a ratio that military history does not often produce. The men who were left were the ones who had survived everything that had already come. They were not going to be frightened by what came next. This is where the military chronicle has to stop and look directly at what the numbers represent. Start with the defenders, 2,300 men in early August. Fewer than 600 remaining by the time the citadel was all that was left. That subtraction, roughly 1,700 dead, is not a statistic to move past. These were Croatian and Hungarian men, with names and families and lives that existed before Szigetvár and ended there. Farmers who had taken up arms because the frontier required it, craftsmen who had trained to fight, professional soldiers who had chosen this life with full knowledge of its costs, officers who had served with Zedrinsky across years of frontier warfare and who stayed when they could have argued for withdrawal and probably been heard. Each one was a specific, irreplaceable human being who walked into Szigetvár in early August and did not walk out. The garrison was not a number in a ledger, it was a community, people who had collectively decided that this place and what it represented was worth their lives. Most of them paid that price in full. Now the Ottoman side, estimates from the period range between 20,000 and 35,000 dead. And those estimates come from sources with reasons to inflate the numbers, so the real figure may be lower. But even at the most conservative reading, you are looking at close to 10 Ottoman soldiers dead for every defender, soldiers who died in the marshy approaches, in the rubble of the new town, in the narrow killing grounds, outside the old town walls, in assault after assault that SHZU ordered. Regardless of what each one cost, the Janissaries suffered most severely. These were not men who could be replaced by general conscription. Their training began when they were children. Their institutional knowledge, delay in how to approach a defended wall, how to coordinate under fire, how to press an assault when every instinct says to stop, was the product of years of experience across many previous campaigns. When they died at Szigetvár, they took with them something the empire could not simply manufacture more of. The losses did not show up in any peace treaty, but they were real, and the Ottoman army that left Szigetvár was not the same army that had arrived. And then there is Sulian. He died in his tent on the night of September 6th, 1566. Heart failure and dysentery, his body already destroyed by gout, finally surrendering under the accumulated strain of the campaign. He was 71 years old. He had reigned for 46 years. He had been the most powerful man in the world for most of his adult life, and he died in a tent in southern Hungary in the dark while 600 men held a crumbling citadel a few hundred meters away from him. He never saw it fall. Grand Vizier Sakalu Mehmed Para stood at the body of the greatest sultan in Ottoman history and made his decision. No one would. No, the meals would continue to be brought to the sultan's tent. His orders would continue to go out in his name. His doctors would be seen entering and leaving his quarters. The sultan's personal physician was strangled to ensure the secret did not spread. An army of 100,000 men besieging a fortress held by fewer than 600. In the name of a man already dead in his tent, soldiers fighting for a sultan who was gone and would not know it for 48 more days. Let that sit for a moment before we go any further. By the morning of September 7th, 1566, the situation in Szigetvár had moved past desperate into something closer to mathematical certainty. The new town was gone. The old town was gone. The citadel had been breached in multiple places by Ottoman sappers who had detonated a mine 2 days earlier, tearing a gap in the walls and setting buildings inside the fortress on fire. The garrison was down to fewer than 600 men. The powder supply was running low, and Maximilian II's 80,000 man army, assembled, equipped, positioned, had not moved, and that needs to be said without softening. The men of Szigetvár were dying to buy time for a relief that was not coming. Maximilian's advisors had counselled caution, a pitched battle against the full Ottoman army at full strength was too great a risk. Losing the relief force would be catastrophic for the broader defense of Europe. The strategic logic was not entirely without foundation. What it could not make right was what it meant for the men inside those walls, dying inside the bayard. Calculation that had already written them off. Zinski gathered his remaining men. What he said to them cannot be recovered word for word. The accounts across the centuries have reconstructed and embellished it, but the substance is consistent in every source that records it. He told them what they had already done. 33 days, the full organized force of the Ottoman Empire, tens of thousands of men dead on the other side of the wall. They had done everything that could be asked of human beings, and then they had done more. He did not say this to comfort them. He said it because it was true, and because what he was about to ask required the full weight of that truth behind it. Now he told them they would do one thing more, not a last defense of walls already broken, not a surrender charge. He dressed for it deliberately. Not armor, the finest clothes of a Croatian nobleman. He carried his father's sword. These were not incidental choices. He knew exactly what was going to happen when those gates opened. He was making sure it looked like what it was. He understood what was going to happen when those gates opened. He wanted it to be seen for exactly what it was, and not a desperate last act, but a statement made by a man who had chosen this end and was choosing how it looked. Before the gates opened, he gave an order. The powder magazine was to be booby-trapped. When the Ottomans rushed into the citadel, the explosion would be his last word in the conversation, delivered after he was gone, planned. While he was still standing, the gates opened. A large mortar was fired into the Ottoman troops masked on the causeway, throwing the Janissary ranks into temporary chaos, and Nicholas Rinsky led 600 men out of the citadel and into The Ottoman army, he was killed almost immediately, 2 bullets. The accounts differ on whether arrows also struck him, but agree on the essential fact he made it a short distance onto the causeway before he fell. His men died around him. They fought until there was no one left to fight. The Ottomans stormed the citadel. The powder magazine detonated. 3,000 more Ottoman soldiers died in the explosion. Zedrinsk's final act delivered. After his death, his last word in the conversation, delivered after he was already gone, the only kind of last word that cannot be answered. He planned it. He ordered it. He walked out the gates, knowing it was coming and would arrive. Without him there to see it, Shuva Bey brought to Zedrinsk's body had it beheaded. The head was sent to the new Sultan Salem II as a trophy. Shuva Bey brought to Zedrinsk's body had it beheaded. The head was sent to the new Sultan Salem II as a trophy. Draw your own conclusions about what 33 days of that resistance had done to him, and perhaps something about what 33 days of Zinsk's resistance had made him feel. The siege was over. The road to Vienna lay open. The Ottoman army did not take it. The question that follows the fall of Szigetvár is not whether what happened was heroic. It clearly was. The question is what it actually accomplished in the world beyond those walls. An honest history means being straight about what it did and what it didn't, even when the cleaner answer is more appealing. The immediate consequence: the Ottoman army stopped despite the road to Vienna lying open, despite Maximilian's 80,000-man army at a safe distance, intact and unused, despite the campaigning season not quite finished. The advance did not come. Sakhalu maimed, Pasha concealing a dead sultan from 100,000 soldiers while commanding an army that had just bled far more than anyone had planned for, made the decision to withdraw. Winter was approaching. The army had lost far more men than Sullian's generals had put into their calculations when they left Constantinople. The Sultan was dead. There were matters in Constantinople that could not be deferred. The Treaty of Adrianople followed in February 1568. Maximilian II, with his 80,000 intact soldiers, chose to negotiate rather than fight. He paid 30,000 ducats to the new Sultan Selim II. The Ottomans received formal confirmation of their authority over Transylvania, Mulavia and Wakyat. The men of Szigetvár bought that negotiation with their lives. Whether the terms of the treaty justified that price is a question history has not answered charitably toward Maximilian, and almost certainly never will. The bigger question is harder. The Ottoman Empire did not mount another serious campaign toward Vienna until 1683. More than a century after Szigetvár, the causes of that pause are multiple and genuinely debated. Solomon's death and the succession pressures it created, the broader strategic overextension of the empire across too many frontiers, the slow modernization of European military capacity, the Ottoman naval defeat at Lento in 1571. 5 years after Szigetvár, there is no clean way to separate Szigetvár's contribution from all the other things that were happening at the same time. The siege was one factor among several, claiming it was the single determining factor would misrepresent the history, but the counterfactual argument is worth taking seriously on its own terms. Cardinal Richelieu, not a man given to romantic gestures about other people's wars, called Szigetvár the battle that saved civilization. The argument runs like this: if Szigetvár falls in days rather than weeks, the Ottoman army has time to advance on Vienna before the campaigning season closes. Vienna with Maximilian's relief force not yet fully positioned might fall if Vienna falls. The strategic balance of Central Europe shifts in ways that cannot be easily reversed. Argument rests on what did not happen, which is always uncertain ground. It is not proof, but the Ottoman army had the manpower, the artillery, and the will. What it did not have after Szigetvár was the time, but underneath all the geopolitical reasoning, there is something simpler, and it does not require a what-if to make it true. Men of Szigetvár stood when they could have retreated. They held far longer than any reasonable expectation allowed. The army that came to destroy them walked away, smaller and slower, and without Vienna. Whether that constitutes saving civilization depends on how you weigh individual moments against the longest sweep of history. What it unquestionably is a choice made with open eyes that echoed far past the moments it was made. The siege of Szigetvár ended on September 7, 1566. In another sense, it has never ended. Within decades of the siege, it had already become something more than a military event. Croatian and Hungarian poets, priests, and noblemen reached for Szigetvár the way peoples reach for their founding stories as proof of what they were capable of when everything was against them. The most significant literary response came nearly a century later. Nikola Zedrinsk's great-grandson, also named Nikola, also a soldier, also a Croatian, Hungarian nobleman trying to hold his people together under Habsburg rule with the Ottomans still pressing from the south, wrote an epic poem called Szigetvár Adorned, The Peril of Sziget, published in 1651. It is considered one of the masterpieces of Baroque literature in both Croatian and Hungarian. The poem transformed the historical siege into something mythic. Written Sinals Zinski as Christian hero, his stand as a sacrifice of providential weight, the fortress as the place where one man's refusal to yield bent the course of something much larger than himself. What the poem was doing went beyond the literary. It was political and cultural work of the most serious kind. It gave two peoples, Croatians and Hungarians, living under Habsburg rule, their territories diminished, their political autonomy reduced. A story about what they could be at their best and most resolute. Here was proof written in blood and held in memory that small peoples could stand against great empires, pay everything and still change the outcome. The memory of Szigetvár was not just something to mourn over, it was something to use. A story a people could pick up and carry when their own times got hard enough. The Ottoman side of the story was not simple either. Suleiman's internal organs were buried at the site of his death. Ottoman custom honored even the field. An ornate tomb was built over the location. For a century after the siege, Muslims from across the empire made the journey there. A mosque, a Sufi lodge, a hospital grew up around the tomb, and the site became a place of genuine pilgrimage. The man who died there was not forgotten. On his own side of the wall, in the 20th century, something unexpected happened. A Turkish-Hungarian memorial park was established near Szigetvár. Former enemies acknowledged a shared history. The siege that had killed tens of thousands on both sides, the Sultan who died within earshot of an unconquered fortress, the garrison that refused every offer to yield what had once been a wound became, with enough time, something two peoples could stand over together, not to relitigate it, but to acknowledge it. This happened here. It cost all of us, we can say that much. Together, it took 4 centuries to get there, but it got there. Any honest telling of Szigetvár has to leave certain things open, not because the evidence is thin, but because some questions are genuinely still there. 4.5 centuries later, why didn't Maximilian Roman II come? He had 80,000 men and 33 days. The most charitable reading is that his advisors genuinely believed the risk of a pitched battle against the full Ottoman army outweighed the potential gain that losing the relief force would have damaged the broader European defense in ways that could not be recovered from. The less charitable reading is that he was simply not equal to what the moment required of him. Both are probably partly right. Whatever the reason, he had 80,000 men, and he did not move them. The men inside Szigetvár paid for that decision. That does not change, regardless of how charitably you read his motives. And the men who died inside those walls died partly because of it. That fact does not soften with time. How many Ottomans actually died? The figures of 20,000 to 35,000 come from sources with every incentive to inflate the number. The real total may be significantly lower, even at 10,000 dead. The most conservative, serious estimate, the toll for a single fortress over 33 days, is extraordinary. The precise figure matters less than the pattern it represents. A garrison of a few thousand men bled one of the most powerful armies in the world at every single phase of the siege, from the first assault to the powder magazine. Without once breaking, did the siege stop the Ottoman advance? Probably yes, partly, but also Sulian's death and the end of the campaigning season and the succession pressures pulling the army back toward Constantinople. Pull on any one of those threads, and the others come with it. You cannot separate them cleanly, and anyone who tells you otherwise is oversimplifying. Szigetvár contributed, so did the other factors. Claiming it was the single cause would be more than the evidence supports. Dismissing its contribution would misread what the evidence shows. What does Zinsk's choice finally mean? Heroism, almost certainly. Strategic calculation, clearly. And something else that is harder to name precisely. A man who had spent his entire adult life watching this frontier contract, watching friends die, watching the slow erosion that never seemed to stop, who had decided that if his end was coming, it was going to come in a way that could not be ignored or easily absorbed. Human motivation is rarely one clean thing. His was probably all of these things tangled together, and none of them made the others less real. Pin it to one thing and you lose what actually made it worth remembering: a man on a wall, the horizon darkening, a road still open behind him, and a choice being made by someone who understood precisely what he was choosing and chose it anyway. The siege of Szigetvár cost somewhere between 20,000 and 35,000 Ottoman soldiers their lives. It cost roughly 1,700 defenders everything they had. It cost Sulian the Magnificent his last campaign, and then his life in a tent within earshot of a fortress he never saw fall. It cost Nicholas Rinsky everything he had. Andres Tabili spent deliberately in a direction he chose, knowing exactly what it meant before he committed to it. What did it purchase? 33 days, certainly. Days the Ottoman army spent in the marshes of southern Hungary instead of on the road to Vienna. Possibly a century-long pause in the Ottoman pressure on Central Europe, though the full credit for that belongs to many factors and not to this one moment alone. Possibly something that cannot be measured in territory or time at all, which may be what Cardinal Richelieu was reaching for when he called it the battle that saved civilization. Whether he was right is a question history has not settled, but he was not a man who said things carelessly. But this story should not close on the geopolitical question. The closing image is the powder magazine. Zerinsky had it booby-trapped before he opened the gates. He was already dead when it went off. 3,000 Ottoman soldiers died in the explosion. His final act delivered in the silence after his death planned. Before he ever walked out the gate, he could not have known exactly how many it would kill. He could not have known whether anyone would be there to count, or write it down, or tell it to people who were not present. He ordered it anyway. It was his final insistence that the garrison of Szigetvár had not merely held on, it had chosen, acted, and made the Ottomans pay for every hour of it, and it would keep making them pay even after the last man was in the ground. We were here and we fought, we cost you everything we could. Remember us. They are remembered in Croatian epic poetry and Hungarian national memory. In a joint memorial park in southern Hungary, where former enemies stand on the same ground and acknowledge the same history. And in this video, more than 4.5 centuries later, because the choice one man made on a wall in the summer of 1566 has not finished echoing some choices. Do that if this story stayed with you. If it was the 33 days or Maximilian's failure to move, or the powder magazine going off after Zerinsky was already gone, drop a comment and tell us which part hit hardest. We read everyone. If you believe more people should know this story, like this video and share it. That is how history like this reaches the audience it deserves. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the time. There is more where this came from. Stories like this one about people who made choices that still matter and whose names deserve to be known. We'll see you in the next one. The siege is over. The echo isn't